students, let us continue with module 17 of unit 2, and today we are going to discuss about factor price equalization theorem. One of important component of the Heckscher-Ohlin model is the factor price equalization theorem. The factor price equalization theorem focuses on the fact that even if the factors are immobile between countries, this can lead to the equalization of factor prices between countries due to the presence of international trade. And this is mostly due to the fact that the countries share the common technology and free trade prevails between both the countries, and CRS production is available. Now, this is very important in the context that even if there is no intermingling of factors between two countries, trade has the power to equalize the relative factor prices between both the countries. This is one of the most important findings of the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, as it shows as a substitute for the factor mobility between countries. Now, to understand this, we consider two countries, country 1 and country 2. Both are producing its product using two homogeneous factors of production, that is labor and capital, and they are producing two goods, say X and Y. To understand this model, we can understand by taking some few simple assumptions, like there is a pure competition that prevails in both product and factor market. The factor intensity does not reverse at any given wage rental ratio. That is, there is a non-reversibility of factor intensity for both the commodities. The production technology shared by both the country is same. Constant return to scale prevails, that is, both the countries are using an homogeneous production function of degree 1, and there is absence of any kind of externalities in production. It can be because of this that the production of output depends only upon the inputs that are used on production, and there is no other impact of other input or inputs on inputs. When these assumptions are satisfied, this leads to two important factors. One, there is a commodity price equalization, and there is an incomplete specialization for both the countries with trade. With the prices of the goods in the relative terms being equalized due to opening of trade, this will lead to equalization of relative factor prices too. This is the important proposition of the factor price equalization theorem that we are going to deal in this particular model. The factor price equalization theorem states that given the first 5 assumptions followed with incomplete specialization, the country, there exists an one-to-one correspondence between relative factor prices with that of commodity prices, and equalization of commodity prices between both the countries after trade will lead to equalization of relative factor prices too. And this will happen if there is no impediments to trade or there is no transport cost. By impediments of trade, we mean any kind of barrier to trade, which can be like tariff, quota, etc. this factor price equalization theorem, we will consider the following example. Let us consider two countries. We have country 1 and country 2, which are producing two goods, good X and good Y. Good X is a relatively labor intensive good, whereas good Y is a relative capital intensive good. And we will continue with our assumption, which we have done in the previous modules, that country 2 is a capital abundant country, whereas country 1 is a labor abundant country. To understand, we first considered the analysis from the viewpoint of country 1. As soon as the trade opened, remember, country 1 is now an exporter of good X. When the country 1 starts exporting good X, the rise in the price of good X in the international market will trigger the producers to produce more of good X. In order to produce more of good X, producers will sacrifice good Y and will try to produce more of good X. Assuming that there is a perfect competition in the market, the production will shift along the PPA from more of Y to less of Y towards more of X. For this to happen, resources must be taken away from the production of good Y and put into production of good X. But mind you, good Y was a capital intensive good. So the bundle that will be released from production of good Y will not exactly be the bundle which is required to initiate the production of good X, because good X is now labor intensive good, whereas good Y is a capital intensive good. The demand requirement for good X is relatively different than the bundle released from good Y. This will trigger the demand for labor in country 1. A triggering of demand of labor in country 1 will pressurize the wages in country 1 in relative to returns of capital, that is R, assuming that there is a fixed supply of the factors in the country. The market change will lead to a rise in the price of labor and decrease in the return of capital, which in turn will increase the wage rental ratio in country 1. And the rise in the wage rental ratio will now initiate the producer to shift their production process. The whole process can be explained with the help of a diagram. Let us consider the demand for labor and capital in country 1 after trade has opened. The left side of the panel shows the demand for capital. After the trade opening and rise in demand of X, which is a labor intensive good, the demand of capital falls. The fall in demand, given the supply of capital which is assumed to be fixed, the rental returns of capital falls. However, the demand of good X has gone up, which is a labor intensive good, and as the demand of labor has gone up, given the fixed supply of labor, the wage rate in the country goes up. As a result, the wage rental ratio in the country 1 has increased. If we look from the isocost and isoquant perspective for both the good, suppose the initial wage rental ratio in country 1 was WR0, is denoted by thick isoquant line. When WR0 was the isocost line, the country was producing at this particular point of tangency between the isoquant and the isocost line. At the new wage rental ratio, that is W1, the producers now shift to an isoquant at a higher level and is now producing at the tangency. But it's interesting to note that the relative capital intensity of production has gone up for good X. Similarly, for good Y, at wage rental ratio 0, the country was producing at this particular point where the isoquant was tangent to isocost line. With rise in wage rental ratio, the isocost line is now triggering the producers to produce at this particular point where the relative capital intensity of production has gone up. The chief reason for rise in the relative capital intensity in country 1, which is a labor abundant country, is the rise in the wage rental ratio. Now labor is becoming relatively costlier to the producers, and the producers are now slowly shifting to capital intensive production. The adjustment of the producer to changing relative factor price is accompanied by international trade. And we observe that country 1 is now becoming relatively more capital intensive in production despite being a labor abundant country. The similar adjustment will take place in country 2. Mind you, country 2 was a capital intensive country which has a higher amount of capital abundance and was exporting good Y, which was an capital intensive product. With opening of trade, the demand of good Y goes up in nation 2, and the producer responds by taking away factors of production from production of good X and putting it in production of good Y. Again, the prices of capital will go up in nation 2 and the relative return of labor will fall. As a result, the wage rental ratio in country 2 will fall, and the capital abundant country will be preferring to produce more toward labor intensive production. This will continue till the point the producer reach a new equilibrium, that is denoted by the point of tangency of the isoquant line with the isocost line, that is W equal to MRTS. We observe that at a general equilibrium framework, the wage rental ratio in country 1 was less than wage rental ratio in country 2 prior to trade. Now when trade begins, the wage rental ratio in country 1 begins to rise as discussed earlier, whereas the wage rental ratio in country 2 begins to fall because of rise in return of capital. This will slowly reduce this gap, and trade will continue till the point this difference is eliminated. Thus, there is a factor price equalization due to trade. We can understand this with the help of a diagram. In the previous module, we have discussed that there is a positive relationship between price ratios and the wage rental ratios. Now, since both the countries are following a common technology, we will have a upward sloping line which is common for both the country. Wage rental ratio for country 1 is an autarky situation. Wage rental ratio 2 is autarky situation for country 2. As trade open, wage rental ratio in country 1 rises due to rise in price of good X relative to good Y, whereas for country 2, the wage rental ratio will fall due to rise in price of commodity 2. As a result, rise in return of the capital due to the fact that good Y is a capital intensive good. So given the technical possibilities of production, that there is a definite relationship between the relative factor price, that is W by R, and the factor proportion in two industries relative to the commodity prices. Since by assumptions the productions are identical in both the country, we can show that with the help of a particular PP line, and the countries will remain on this PP prime line due to the assumptions taken earlier. From this, we can point out that factor price equalization can take place. But how does it happen? For any commodity, the price ratio at which the country specializes incompletely corresponds to the price ratio that belongs to PP prime diagram. When the assumption is common for both the countries, the final equilibrium configuration indicates that a country will be on PP prime line, and factor price equalization will happen due to trade, because as long as there is a gap between this, trade will be meaningfully initiating a rise in factor prices for country 1 and fall in wage rental ratio in country 2. We will now try to explain this factor price equalization theorem with the help of Edgeworth box diagram. The Edgeworth box diagram is a very wonderful instrument which helps in explaining the endowment of both the factors in both the countries simultaneously. What we will do is that we will superimpose the Edgeworth box of country 2 on the Edgeworth box of country 1 in such a way that origin of good X coincides for both the country. Now, to understand this proof, we see that since both the country has the same technology, the isoquant of commodity X in both the countries are identical and are measured along a common origin, that is OX. Now, note in this diagram, the Edgeworth box of country 1 is denoted by the relatively flatter box. This is because in country 1, there is a labor abundance and country 1 is producing more of labor intensive good. For country 2, we have more of capital abundance and the country will be producing more of capital intensive good, that is good Y. Before trade begins, we observe that country 1 is producing at point B, whereas country 2 is producing at point B dash. Before that, let us understand the idea of Edgeworth box diagram. Good X is measured along the horizontal axis for country 1 and good Y is measured along the vertical axis. Whereas for nations 2, good X is measured along the horizontal axis, whereas good Y is measured along this downward sloping axis. So for nation 2, as we move downward, good Y increases, and as we move leftward, good X decreases. For country 2, as we move rightward, good X increases, and as we move upward, good Y increases. Now the countries in a no trade situation are producing at point A for country 1 and A dash for country 2 for the given relative price ratios. Now, since nation 1 is using smaller amount of capital to produce the good, we have a very low capital labor ratio in country 1 and the productivity of labor and therefore wage rate is also lower, while the productivity of capital and the rate of return is higher in nation 1 in compared to nation 2. Now, this happens when the production function is homogeneous of degree 1. Now, with lower W and a higher R, the W by R ratio is lower in nation 1 than in nation 2. This is consistent with the relative physical abundance definition of labor in nation 1 and capital in nation 2. The lower W by R in nation 1 at autarky at point A basically reflects an smaller absolute slope, the production, as opposed to that of point A dash. To summarize, that in a no trade equilibrium point A, nation 1 is using a smaller K by L ratio in production of commodities as compared to nation 2. This results in a lower productivity of labor and a higher productivity of capital in nation 1 than in nation 2. Note, nation 1 is a labor abundant country compared to nation 2. Now, as trade opens, country 1 will specialize in production of good X. It will move from point A to point B. This means the country is now producing more of good X. Remember, we are measuring X on the horizontal axis rightwards. And with the opening of trade, nation A moves from point A to point B, where it is now producing higher amount of good X. Mind you, we are measuring good X for country 1 in the right direction of the horizontal axis. At point B, observe that now it is using a higher amount of capital labor ratio. Similarly, for nation 2, as trade open, it is now producing more amount of good Y. It moves from A dash to B dash. And the intensity of capital has now changed from earlier and are now more X incentive. We observe that there is a change in the price ratios due to change in intensity of production for both the countries after opening of trade. This is exactly opposite for capital as compared to labor. In the absence of trade, wage rental ratio was lower in nation 1 as compared to nation 2, and as nation 1 specialized in production of commodity X, the capital labor ratio and wage rental ratio rises in production of both the commodities. For nation 2, it specializes in the production of commodity Y. Capital labor ratio as well as wage rental ratio falls in production of both the commodities. The specialization of production continues till the capital labor ratio and wage rental ratio becomes equal for both the nations. Thus, given our assumptions, which justifies that international trade leads to equalization of relative prices of commodity as well as factor prices of commodity. But now a question arises, can international trade lead to an absolute factor price equalization? This we can explain with the help of an Euler theorem. We know, according to Euler theorem, that if constant return to scale prevails in production and if the factors are paid according to their productivity, then the total product will be exhausted. That is, L into MPL plus K into MPK is equal to the total amount of production of good X, which is denoted by equation 1. We can adjust this equation by dividing by labor from both sides. We get MPL plus K by L MPK is equal to X by L. X is the total output of good X divided by total amount of labor gives the average product of labor. We can adjust MPL by taking it common and we get MPL 1 plus K by L MPK by MPL. With nation 1 produces at point B and nation 2 produces at point B dash in our Edgeworth box diagram. Mind you, the wage rental ratio was same across both the country due to the factor price equalization in relative term. So MPK and MPL will also be same because we know at the equilibrium of production MPL by MPK is equal to W by R for both the nations. We also know that at B and B dash the capital labor ratio in production of commodity X is same in both the nation. For capital by labor ratio to be same, we also have the average product of labor which is measured by X by L. This for both the nation due to assumption of similar production technology and constant return to scale. The last component that is left is the marginal product of labor. Now, for equation 1 to hold, if all other factors are same across both the nation, MPL must have to be same across the nation. And we know the real wage of production is equal to the marginal productivity of the factor. So this implies that if the marginal productivity of factor is same across the factors, the real wage will also be same for both the factors of production. So this helps us conclude that the absolute factor prices will also be equalized in both the nations due to trade. In this module, we covered two important aspects of Heckscher-Ohlin model. One, that international trade may lead to a relative factor price equalization, and not only that, it leads to an absolute factor price equalization too. Thank you.